And I'm back. Guess what, guys? This one, a double feature. I know, crazy, right? But I figure, we're so close to the end. The last two chapters, between the two of them, only have like 41 pages. So this one's going to be a much longer video. I'm going to take a pause, which you won't even notice, between the chapter 9 and chapter 10. And then I may do a short video, or a short one, reading like the epilogue. And actually, hold on. Epilogue. Okay, the epilogue's only like 2.5 pages long, 3 pages, something like that. So I'm gonna read that as well. So buckle up and be prepared to be here a while. But you guys know how I do by now. Anyway, so what has happened in the last hour and a half? Oh, I ate lunch, watched a super sad movie. I have my my water. Before I was drinking coffee, not good on the vocal cords. I've turned down the fan because I felt like maybe it was a little too loud last time. I am back in my bedroom, doors closed, everything is right with the world. So let us get started in this next chapter. Let's see where Alanna's adventure takes us, shall we? Chapter 9, The Ordeal. Soon after her birthday, Alanna and Gary went for a day's ride in the royal forest. Jonathan watched them leave, knowing what Alanna wanted to discuss with his big cousin. He was nervous, and he wondered how Alanna, with so much more at stake, felt. "Whatever's on your mind, you may as well say it now and get it over with," Gary advised after they had been riding in silence for an hour. "It must be pretty important." Alanna wiped a sprinkling of sweat off of her upper lip. It is," she admitted. Gary, has it ever occurred to you that I might not be the person I seem to be?" He shrugged. "I know you've had a big secret ever since I first met you," he admitted. "I always figured you'd tell me what it was eventually." Alanna drew a deep breath. "I'm a girl," she said bluntly. My real name is Alanna. I come from Trabond, and Lord Tom really is my twin brother." Gary drew his horse up abruptly, staring at her. "That's not funny." Alanna drew her gaze off the back of Moonlight's neck, where she had fixed it. "Of course it's not funny. It's the truth." "Where are your breasts?" he demanded. Alanna blushed. "I bind them flat with a special corset I wear." "But when you bathe..." Gary stopped and whistled. "None of us have ever seen you bathe, or swim for that matter." "That's right." Gary tugged his mustache deep in thought. "Who else knows?" He asked softly. Alanna swallowed hard. He didn't seem to be angry. Jonathan, George, and Mistress Cooper, Coram, my brother Tom, the healing woman at Trabond, Faithful. She petted the cat riding in his special cup on Moonlight's saddle. For several long moments, she could only hear the birds and the forest animals around them. Gary's face was unreadable, but knowing him as she did, she guessed he was putting together all the odds and ends that had puzzled him about her through the years. Suddenly, a broad smile broke across Gary's face, and his eyes crinkled with merriment. "Oh, I can't wait to see their faces," he whooped as he burst into laughter. "Anyone in particular?" Alanna wanted to know, puzzled by his amusement. Jonathan had said Gary would react this way, but it hadn't seemed possible to her. "Everyone," the knight gasped, wiping his streaming eyes. "Just everyone." He continued to laugh as they rode and talked. Alanna explained everything to him, with the exception of the love she shared with Jonathan. He was amused and delighted about all of it, and happy to be involved. "Of course I'll instruct you when you take the sacramental bath. I'd be insulted if you asked anyone else." he informed her over their picnic lunch. Wait a minute. You're Squire. Have you picked anyone? Alanna shook her head. I talked it over with your father, and he agreed that it would be a waste of time for me to pick someone when I plan to leave right after midwinter. Right after you tell them who you are, you mean? Alanna nodded. A squire couldn't go with me in any case, even if the truth weren't to come out. Gary cocked an eyebrow at her. Surely you don't think they'll be glad to be rid of you when they find out the truth? Won't they? Duke Gareth's son was no fool. Some will, he said finally. Those who don't know you well almost certainly will feel that way, but your friends, I think you're being too harsh on them. He sprang up, helping her pack their saddlebags once again. Oh, I can't wait. John was relieved and jealous when he saw Alanna and Gary that night at dinner, smiling and relaxed. They quickly told him what happened. It gave all three of them something to talk about and laugh over in secret. During the long summer, those talks were good for Alanna, so used to seeing her masquerade as a life or death matter, she had never learned to laugh about it. Gary, Jonathan, and George proceeded to teach her, and she gathered new insights about what she had done and about those closest to her from them. Somehow, the prospect of telling the truth seemed less terrifying as a result. To everyone who knew her, Alanna seemed to change in the months between her 18th birthday and midwinter festival. She was still attentive in her classes, performing her duties perfectly, but it was obvious her thoughts were elsewhere. She often sneaked into the city in disguise, going to the temple of the Great Mother Goddess to meditate. She had a good many things to ponder. John, George, Tom, Duke Roger. The proper time to tell the king and queen the truth, but chief on her mind was the iron door of the chamber of ordeal. What she feared there, or why, she was never quite certain. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she wished she could grab time and hold on to it, keeping it from going forward. Even the thought that she might pass the ordeal and leave on her adventures gave her no pleasure. She had learned to love the palace and the people who lived there, and she knew she would miss them. In fact, she was no longer positive she wanted to go. So don't leave, Miles advised when she mentioned it to him. Most young knights fight in the service of the realm after they get their shields. Certainly Duke Gareth and His Majesty will be more than happy to have you stay. Alanna shook her head. The only thing she still looked forward to was the relief of telling everyone who she was. She got up and hugged her shaggy friend impulsively. I love you, Miles, she whispered, blinking back tears. I'll come often, I promise. Miles patted her back gently and offered her his handkerchief. I know you will. I may not know much, but that I do know. George watched her pace his chambers, his hazel eyes unreadable. You're only wearing yourself out, he pointed out practically. How will you be staying awake all night if you tire yourself out in the afternoon? Alanna wiped her hand over her sweating face. I don't think I've ever been this scared in my life, George. Not when you fought the Yazdir, or when you almost drowned while skating. She shook her head, fingering the ember stone at her throat. Not when you faced Dane or the Toussaint Knight attacking you. No, don't you see? I could fight them. Dealing with something I can't see, something I know nothing about? Alanna boosted Faithful up on her shoulder and went over to the window, staring out at the city. I can't do anything except let it happen. That isn't the way I do things, George. You of all people should know that. Here. The thief pressed a glass of brandy into her hand, sipping from one he had poured himself. "I've been keeping this bottle by special. And what's more special than now, the day before your ordeal? Drink up, lass." Alanna obeyed, savouring the brandy's rich taste. "This is really good," she approved. "Normally I just drink this stuff to clear my head, but this is quite pleasant." "You didn't steal it, did you?" she demanded, as suspicious as ever. Faithful jumped down from her shoulder as George laughed outright. "Would I serve you or John stolen goods?" he asked. "No, don't answer me. Look, here's the tax stamp on it, as clear as day. Vintages like this are better than gold and better watched." Alanna yawned. It's not that I don't trust you, George. So sleepy." She looked at her friend through rapidly closing eyes. You drugged it!" she accused. George caught her as she sagged, her eyelids fluttering shut. "Did you really think I'd let you fret yourself sick with such an important night ahead of you?" he asked softly. Alanna muttered and stirred, sound asleep. George scooped her up and carried her to his bedroom, placing her gently on his bed. "You knew," he commented to Faithful as the cat leapt up beside Alanna. "Why didn't you warn her?" "I was putting a little extra in the brandy." The cat switched his tail. "Cover her up well," he advised George. "She gets cold easily." The thief laughed and obeyed before joining Gary, Rawl, and Jonathan downstairs. George returned Alanna to the palace just after sunset, where the ritual of midwinter and the ordeal caught up to her at last, leaving her only enough time to worry about doing everything properly. She ate lightly. If Miles hadn't stood over her for every bite, she would have eaten nothing at all. Then she changed into the white garments she would wear in the chamber of ordeal. Shortly after the 8th hour was cried, Jonathan and Gary came to escort her to the baths. As Alanna splashed into the unheated water, her friends waited in a nearby chamber talking quietly. "I wish this was over," Jonathan announced, listening to Alanna. Gary looked at Jonathan's face and poured his cousin a glass of wine. "Relax, will you? We survived the ordeal." "Barely." He drained his glass. "Barely, perhaps, but we survived. She will too. And remember this. We're taught that the magic of the chamber can't be influenced by anything. When she passes the ordeal, no one will be able to say she didn't earn her shield, whether she's a girl or not." Alanna emerged from the bath, dried and dressed. She was a little pale, Gary noticed, but otherwise calm. "Are you prepared to be instructed?" he asked formally. Alanna licked her dry lips. This is where it began. "I am," she whispered. "If you survive the ordeal of knighthood," Jonathan said, using the words required by ritual, "you will be a knight of the realm. You will be sworn to protect those weaker than you, to obey your overlord, to live in a way that honors your kingdom and your gods. To wear the shield of a knight is an important thing," Gary went on. "It means you may not ignore a cry for help. It means that rich and poor, young and old, male and female, may look to you for rescue, and you cannot deny them. You are bound to uphold the law," Jonathan said. "You may not look away from wrongdoing. You may not help anyone to break the law of the land. And you must prevent the breaking of the law at all time, in all cases. You are bound to your honor and your word," Gary reminded her. "Act in such a way that when you face the dark god, you need not be ashamed. You have learned the laws of chivalry," Jonathan continued. Keep them in your heart. Use them as your guides when things are their darkest. They will not fail you if you interpret them with humanity and kindness. A knight is gentle. A knight's first duty is to understand." Alanna listened carefully. None of this was new, but tonight it had more meaning than it ever had before. Tonight she would hold vigil in the chapel outside the chamber of the ordeal, the first step toward proving herself finally worthy of a knight's shield. And tomorrow? I'll think about tomorrow. Tomorrow, she told herself firmly. Gary and John took her to the chapel of the ordeal, stopping only to remind her that she could not utter a sound between that point and the time when she stepped out of the chamber the next day. Gary patted her on the shoulder, and Jonathan kissed her cheek. Then they were gone, and she was alone in the chapel, looking at the heavy iron door leading to the chamber. 4 years ago, she had knelt here beside Jonathan, watching his face and wondering what he was thinking. Now it was her turn, and she still had no idea of what his thoughts had been that night. Was his heart beating too fast as hers did now? Had he been scared? This not being able to talk was hard. There was nothing a would-be knight could do but think. After a while, her thoughts drifted. Coram had arrived 2 nights ago. They had remained up for the better part of the night while he gave her his last report as steward of Trebond. Now, young Armin had the dubious task of that post, and Alanna's old friend was looking forward to being on the road with her. She was proud that her first teacher had been impressed by how far she had come in 4 years. Alanna refused his compliments, pointing out that if she had done well, it was because he had taught her well. The remainder of the night had been spent poring over maps, deciding where they would go in search of adventure. Alanna smiled a little sadly to herself. Funny, she thought. It used to be I couldn't wait to go, and now that the time to leave is here, I only want to stay. Why can't I be happy? Or at least, why can't I make up my mind? Where was Tom? He had planned to be at the palace by Midwinter Festival, but so far there was no sign of him. Had he forgotten her in pursuit of some weird old spell? In some ways, he reminded her of their father, who had spent much of his life in a scholarly dream. She let her thoughts roam. Touching the emberstone, she remembered the dark night she had met the great goddess. Why had the mother given her the stone? Was it a weapon? Or a keepsake? She thought of Jonathan. Marrying him wouldn't be so bad. Someday, she realized. Yet that was impossible. He had to marry for the good of Tortle, and certainly she didn't want to marry now. She had too much to do. Duke Roger. So many strange things had happened over the years that forced her to wonder what he was doing. And yet, she had never pursued her suspicions very far. Why not? Was she simply jealous of Jonathan's colorful relative and of the hold Roger had over people? Or did she have real cause to think he meant her prince ill? The goddess had tried to warn her in a very subtle way. Did the gods want Alanna to confront Roger? And with what? She thought rebelliously. I have no proof against him, and no way to obtain proof. I would lose everything, honor, reputation, friends, perhaps even my life. If I accused Roger without solid evidence in my hands, I hope the gods don't think I'm that reckless, or that stupid. Suddenly she blinked. Light was touching the high windows of the chapel, and the dark-robed priests were filling into the room. One touched her shoulder, pointing to the heavy iron door. It was time for the ordeal. Alanna got up stiffly, wincing at the pain in her knees. Where had the knight gone? Rubbing her shoulders and grimacing, she followed the silent priest to the front of the chapel, her attention fixed on the men unbarring the door of the chamber, until that was all she saw. Her heart pounding furiously, her mouth dry. She did not realize that behind the door, behind her, the chapel was filling with her friends. Silently, the door to the chamber of the ordeal swung open. Swallowing hard, Alanna braced her shoulders and walked inside. Swiftly, the priest closed the door, leaving her in total darkness, just as she had so often dreamed. She blinked, letting her eyes get used to the light inside the chamber. Oddly enough, there was light. Although there were no torches or windows, it was ghostly, but it was there. Hope flared up in her heart. Perhaps she would be all right. She was in a small stone room. It was completely bare of furnishings or fixtures. There was no doors or windows, no way anything could enter, and Alanna was beginning to wonder if this was some kind of joke when the first blast of icy wind knocked her to her knees. Alanna hugged herself, her teeth chattering, her clothes no protection at all. I wish I had dressed for this, she thought, forcing down the panic that washed over her whenever she was too cold. The harsh wind whipped through her, forcing her down again every time she tried to stand, numbing her hands and feet. Alanna tried to move about, slapping herself to get warm, but the wind pushed her flat against the floor, making it almost impossible to move. She fought it with all her strength, her lower lip gripped between her teeth. She even forgot her fear. The only important thing now was to stay alive. Suddenly she heard voices. The wind stopped as abruptly as it began. The voices rose, begging Alanna to help them, to rescue them from the dark god. She recognized them. Her father, Big Thor, boys who had died during the sweating sickness, men who were killed fighting Tusain. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She wanted to help them, but there was just no way she could. They belonged to the dark god now, as much as she hated it. She was helpless. The voices stopped. Alanna stood slowly, feeling herself tremble. What next? Something in the corner behind her clicked. Alanna spun and quickly bit her fist to keep from screaming. She must not cry out. But how was she expected to stay silent when a spider, the size of a horse, advanced on her? She hated spiders. Backing into a corner, she gritted her teeth together so hard they hurt. The spider came on, clicking hungrily. It brushed her with a long, hairy foreleg. And then she was drowning, just as she nearly had drowned when she was 5, and again last winter, when someone salted the ice on the skating pond. Not for the first time she wondered if she had been meant to drown beneath that weakened ice. She could not forget Alex had been there once again, and Alex had challenged her to skate. Odd thoughts to have when you're drowning, I suppose, she mused as she fought her way up. Her strength was running out, and even the discovery that she couldn't reach the surface resulted in nothing more than exhausted dismay. No, she thought, I won't cry out. I'll die if I have to, but I won't cry out. The ocean was gone. Alanna knelt on the chamber floor, taking huge breaths of air as silently as she could, and wondered what would happen next. Her skin and clothes were completely dry. Nothing happened. Alanna waited, not quite cringing, afraid that whatever this demon place threw at her would be worse than anything that had gone before. Finally, she began to pace, rubbing her arms. She was still very cold. Cold, being helpless against death, spiders, drowning. The chamber made her live vividly with everything she most feared. Was that what the ordeal was about? Making would-be knights face their fears? She sneezed and looked up. The air was humming with power, and a pale blotch was spreading against one stone wall. It was filled with colors and shapes, but they did not resolve into the picture they seemed to form. Alanna narrowed her eyes to see if they would focus in. but the picture remained hazy. Something told her it was important, even vital, for her to see that vision clearly, no matter what the cost. She strained against the haze, reaching toward the wall. Her hands hit something solid, almost cloth-like, keeping her from the vision. Alanna gritted her teeth and gripped the invisible stuff in her hands, feeling fine threads cut into her palms as she tried to tear a hole through which she could see. Sweat poured down her cheeks, and she forgot how cold she was. Her fingers found some of an invisible opening. She tugged hard, the sinews in her arm cramping with effort. A barrier in front of her, magical or real, she had no way of knowing, gave way. And she fell forward onto her knees. The picture on the wall was clear, too clear. A triumphant, smiling Roger stood beside Jonathan's bed. Alanna's prince lay on it, his hands crossed on his chest, a crown on his head. Jonathan was whiter than marble, the white of death. Laughing soundlessly, Roger took the crown from Jonathan's head and put it on his own. Alanna threw herself at the picture, opening her mouth to scream. Only at the last minute did she remember to remain silent. She bit her lip to keep her mouth closed. Her mind continued to scream, "No!" as she beat her fists raw on the invisible wall that kept her away from Duke Roger. At last she dropped to the floor, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No," she thought, clenching her bruised and bloody hands. "It won't happen. I won't let it happen. I will never let Jonathan die." Slowly, the chamber door opened. She stumbled out, her hands torn and bloody, her mouth a thin, tight line. John and Miles hurried forward to help her out of the chapel, Faithful and Coram following. The prince put healing salve on her hands and bandaged them before the men put her to bed. Alanna looked at him, her eyelids already heavy. "It won't happen, John. I promise it won't." Jonathan wiped the sweat-soaked hair away from her forehead. "I know it won't," he whispered. "Now sleep. It's over." "It's not over," she wanted to say, but she was too tired. Her eyes shut, and she slept soundlessly, without dreams. She had not spoken or screamed at all. The ceremony of knighthood at sunset was brief. The real ceremony, the ordeal, was over, and this was just a formality. Alanna knelt before the king and gave her oath of fealty, swearing to defend the crown and Tortle all her life. In return, the king touched his sword to Alanna's shoulders and head, saying gently, "I dub thee Sir Alan, Knight of the realm of Tortle. Serve honorably and well." Alanna stood. It was strange. She didn't feel any different, except tired and shaken. But now, she was a knight. A slender, red-bearded man stepped out of the crowd, beckoning Coram forward. Tom grinned at his startled twin. "Your Majesties," he said politely, bowing to the king and queen. "I am Tom, Lord of Trabond, and a master of the Mithrin Light. I beg leave, by right of my relationship to Sir Alan, to present him with his shield." He gestured toward the large leather-covered object Coram bore. The king inclined his head, refusing to stare at the very young master at his court was doing. "You have the right, Lord Tom." Tom removed the shield cover, revealing a black tower on a red field, the Trabond arms. Taking it from Coram, Alanna settled it on her left arm. It was light and strong. She could feel the protection spells on it. She bowed to her brother and to the king and queen, then glanced around startled by the sound of cheers. They were cheering her. She shook her head, blushing. They had cheered when Jonathan was knighted, of course, but this was something else. He was the heir, and an heir who was a knight was far more powerful than an heir who wasn't. But she found a place in their hearts, and they cheered her because they loved her. Tom went with her to her room to put the shield away. He greeted Faithful solemnly as Alanna placed the shield on her bed in order to look it over. I thought you weren't going to be here at all, she observed, touching the shield with a bandaged hand. This is beautiful. I was held up because I wanted to make it secretly. Watch this. Smiling slightly, he passed his hand over the shield's face. Alanna stared as the black tower faded, leaving instead a great gold cat on its hind legs. What is it? She asked as the cat faded and the tower reappeared. Tom helped her put the cover on the shield and hang it in her dressing room with her other arms. It's a lioness rampant, of course, for when you reveal what you really are. Let's go to dinner. I'm starved. Alanna led the way to the banquet hall, thinking, a lioness rampant. I like it. Okay, guys, that was chapter 9. We are about to start chapter 10, and then we will go over all of my thoughts. But who is excited? I'm excited. Are you excited? I hope you are. Anyway, I'm going to take a quick break to get a drink real quick, and then we'll start chapter 10. I'm so excited. Chapter 10. To Duel the Sorcerer. The second feast of the Midwinter Festival had begun, with nearly every noble of Rold's court present. Tom excused himself to Alanna with a wink and went to sit with Duke Roger, who showed no sign of bad feeling toward a younger and maybe stronger sorcerer. Alanna watched them talk for a few moments before turning her attention to the other people there. The Queen had made a rare appearance. It was the first time Alanna had seen Jonathan's mother in public since her illness more than a year before. Leanne seemed to be holding her own for a while, but slowly she turned very pale. From her seat among the other knights, Alanna could see beads of sweat on Leanne's face, and the Queen's fingers trembled as she tried to raise her wine glass. When she began to cough, Duke Baird rushed to her, his face tense and worried. Remembering her vision in the chamber of the ordeal, Alanna grabbed the ember stone at her throat. She bit her lower lip. As she feared, Queen Leanne was glowing a faint but steady orange. Suddenly, Alanna was filled with the need to act, and act now. If Roger had placed magic on any kind on the Queen, there would have to be a physical evidence of some kind, somewhere. Even the most powerful sorcerer had to have a real object as the focus of his thoughts. Alanna waited until the feast was in full swing before excusing herself, promising her friends she would only be gone a few moments. Now was the time while Roger's attention was fully occupied with Tom and the questions her brother represented. The king would not rise for another hour at least. Alanna planned to use that hour. Feeling as if she had gained a new life and a sharper way of looking at things in the chamber of the ordeal, she hurried back to her chamber. Most of her belongings were packed, since she would be moving in the morning to her own rooms. Faithful, exiled from the feast, was waiting for her. You are taking a risk, the cat said as Alanna searched her trunk for the new lockpicks George had given her. If he catches you, you will be very dead. Then he mustn't catch me. Agreed? Alanna shoved the leather envelope holding the picks into her tunic. Come on, you stand guard. Faithful trotted along as she took the back halls that led to Roger's room. There must be insanity in my family, too. Alanna grinned but did not answer. Roger's suite of rooms was located very conveniently for Alanna's purposes. A small flight of stairs twisted up and away from the hall, ending with Roger's outer door. While Faithful stood guard at the foot of the steps, Alanna set to work, hidden from view by the turn in the wall. Carefully, she inserted the first pick into the lock. It flared and melted. Alanna quickly dropped it, swearing slightly at her own stupidity. Of course Roger would put guarding spells on his doors. She eyed the lock resentfully, deciding what to do next. It would take too long to try a spell that would lift the guards, and she was in a hurry. There was another way. Placing her bandaged hands on the lock, Alanna drew a deep breath. Fiercely, she shoved her magic into the lock, literally exploding Roger's spell. After her eyes cleared from the blinding flash that resulted, Alanna warily tried another lockpick. It took the work of only a second before she heard the tumblers fall into place. The door swung open, and she whistled softly for Faithful. The cat ran swiftly inside. Alanna closed the door behind them. There was no point in searching the main rooms. What she was looking for would not be there. People came and went in these rooms every day. Roger wouldn't leave anything important there. In the rear of the suites, however, was a closed door that led to Roger's workroom. It, too, was locked. Using her ember stone as a guide, Alanna could see the orange fire gleaming against the door. She had expected that. As with the front door, she had no time to figure out which spell would lift the guards. Even if she knew the right spell, which she doubted, the guards on this door would be far more powerful than those on the main door. Steeling herself, Alanna placed her hands against the door and thrust her magic out. This time, she fainted. Faithful brought her around by licking her nose with his rough tongue. "Sleep later," he said. She sneered elegantly at her pet and opened the sorcerer's door. All around the room were containers littered with instruments, herbs, and books. Alanna glanced at the books. She knew some of them and had heard of others. Most were books on magic. Some she could not read because they were written in completely alien script. She noticed seeing crystals of varying sizes and colors, clear, pink, and black. One was blood red and she refused to touch it. The large charcoal burning dishes stood in the center of the room for heat instead of torches. Roger used lamps that burned with a bright, unflickering light. Do I hear splashing?" she asked Faithful softly. She looked around carefully, at last spotting a fountain at the back of the room. Water poured from a spout in the wall, dancing over rocks covered with flowering moss before falling into a deep basin. Curious at the fountain's existence, Alanna went to look at it more closely. Two things caught her interest: a silvery white veil that seemed to hold several objects, and a doll immersed in the fountain's basin directly under the water spout. For a moment, Alanna wanted to touch neither bundle nor doll, but her newfound resolution forced her to pick up both. She carried them over to one of the counters, drawing the lamp close to examine her finds. The doll was a water-worn wax image of the Queen. Perfect, from the real black hairs on its head to the duplicate of the Queen's favorite gown. The doll had obviously been in the water for a long time. The features of its face were barely recognizable, and the color had washed from its dress. Alanna knew this spell. The sorcerer made an image of his victim and placed it in running water. Depending on how the sorcerer's material and power, the strength of the water, the one represented by the doll wasted away quickly or slowly, fading into death. Duke Roger had used the finest wax money could buy, and Alanna suspected he had taken the doll out of the fountain from time to time to make the Queen's illness and eventual death seem more natural. Her hands trembled. Alanna put the doll aside and looked at the bundle she had also found. Lifting it less carefully this time, she saw the tear in the side too late. Another tiny doll fell out of the bundle, striking the table. Alanna yelled, her side suddenly one massive hurt. Biting her fist to keep from making any more noise, she picked the image up. It was one of her, of course. She examined the bundle closely. The tear was long and thin, nearly invisible against the fine woven silk. Her hands throbbed, and she remembered how they had felt the morning of her ordeal, as if she was trying to tear a hole in tightly woven cloth. Drawing her dagger, she cut the string that held the bundle closed and carefully opened it up on the table's surface. Figures that bore eerie resemblances to the king, Duke Gareth, Miles, the Lord Provost, and even Jonathan lay revealed before her eyes. "Of course," she told Faithful softly. "Now I understand. He wanted none of us to see what he was up to, so he put our images inside this veil. We couldn't see, and as long as men like Duke Gareth or Miles or the Provost didn't see anything wrong, no one else felt they could say anything." "What are you going to do now?" Faithful inquired, twitching his tail. "You've broken all those silly rules of chivalry to get yourself this far. What's next?" Alanna smiled grimly at the images, carefully piling them on top of the veil. "Roger can't be allowed to go on this way," she replied. "When he comes back tonight, he'll know the images are gone. He may even know I took them. So, if my friends and I are asked to survive him finding out, I'd better do something about Duke Roger of Conte right now." She returned to the banquet hall, the veil and its contents in her hands. Stopping for a moment to talk to Miles and Jonathan, she asked them to join her before the king's table. Tom was exchanging stories with Rawl and Gary, but when he caught his sister's eye, he excused himself and came to stand next to her. Steeling herself, Alanna walked up the long table in front of the two thrones, bowing low to the king and queen. Only when she felt Miles, Tom, and Jonathan at her back did she begin to speak. "Great Mother, help me with this," she pleaded silently when Rawl acknowledged her. "I don't know if this is how you wanted me to do this, but it's the only way I know how." "Majesty," she said clearly, making sure everyone could hear her voice, "I have done a dishonorable thing." The great hall was suddenly quiet. Alanna drew a deep breath and went on. "I broke into a man's chambers tonight. I knew this was dishonorable, and I did it anyway. What I did was wrong, but what I did find was far worse." She placed the veil and the images inside it on the table before the king. Leanne cried out in horror, shrinking away from the little dolls made to represent her husband and her son, and her brother. The king and Duke Gareth were pale. The provost, peering around his neighbor's shoulder, turned red with fury. Tom reached out curiously for a moment before remembering it would not be a good idea to handle these images. There was no reading the emotions either Jonathan or Miles was feeling. Perhaps it was just as well. Alanna looked at Duke Roger. The sorcerer could see what she had put before his uncle. He was gripping the arms of his chair with his white-knuckled hands. "Shall I tell them where I found these, Your Grace?" Alanna challenged loudly, looking at the Duke of Conte in the eyes. "Shall I tell them about the little fountain in your private workroom, where the Queen's image lay under running water, wasting away little by little? Shall I—" "Liar!" Roger snarled. "Majesty, Sir Alan has long been jealous of my influence with you and my cousin Jonathan. He now seeks to dishonor me in your eyes by showing you these dolls he created and accused me of casting such spells." "For what reason?" she asked King Rold. "Why would I wish the Queen harm? She is the mother of my prince and my friend. She has been kind to me. I do not gain by harming her, just as I do not gain from veiling the sight of those who could stop me, from stealing a throne that isn't mine." "Liar!" Roger cried, standing to point an accusing finger at her. "Do you deny that you have the skill to place such a spell? Do you deny you have the knowledge when I taught image magic to you myself? You planned to kill their majesties so that when Jonathan became king, you would be the most powerful knight in the realm." "That is very interesting." Miles looked at Roger, his gentle eyes hard. "Carry that thinking a step further, and suppose the death of Prince Jonathan, who would gain?" "I submit, Roger, that you would gain as the next king of Tortle." It's a plot against me," he cried, looking around him. "Miles tries to turn you all against me while this young man gives me false evidence." He stopped, waiting for the king to say something. The only sound in the banquet hall was the queen weeping softly into Duke Gareth's shoulder. Roger looked for a friendly face and found none. His mouth tightened. I demand my rights. I demand trial by combat, myself against my accuser." He pointed to Alanna. "If I lie, Sir Alan will win by the will of the gods. But say I will win, because I am innocent." The silence grew as everyone waited for King Roald's decision. The king picked up the image of himself, turning it over in his fingers. "You may have the combat," he said. "As the accused, I may choose the time," Roger said quickly. "Let it be now, before Sir Alan's lies spread and poison people's minds against me." Alanna felt chilly and very old. She should have known that Roger would want to fight now, while she was still wary and sore from the ordeal. She looked at her bandaged hands. "This time or any other is of no matter to me," she said, her voice bored. "I believe Duke Roger to be plotting against the lives of my prince and my friends. The sooner this is resolved, the sooner they will be safe." "In 1 hour," ruled the king, "we meet in the great throne room." Alanna slipped away and went to her room to change while Faithful watched. Since the rules of trial by combat forbade the wearing of armor, she changed into a soft shirt, breeches, and stockings. She wanted as much freedom of movement as possible. Removing the bandages, she carefully rubbed balm into her sore hands, thinking, "Lucky they aren't stiff." After lightly rebandaging her hands, she tied back her hair. Sitting down to clean Lightning, she told Faithful, "I guess I don't feel so bad about not having spotted what he was up to. But why tonight? That hole in the veil didn't just happen to be there." "Come in," she called in answer to the knock on her door. Jonathan, Miles, Coram, and Tom entered the room. Miles looked at her warily. "I suppose you had your reasons for acting as you did. I'd like to know what they are." Alanna shook her head. It's as if I just broke free of the spell he had us all under. A lot of things just began to add up. Why the fog came up that night I was taken after he visited me. Why the big Toussaint attack was chiefly aimed at Jonathan's forces. Why the Queen never got better. Tom, you must have thought I was crazy, never following up on the warnings you and George gave me." Tom shrugged. "I always figured you had your reasons." Jonathan, Miles, and Coram looked at him, and the young master added, "I've been watched by Duke Roger's men for several years, ever since you, Highness, and Alan took the Black City. And George has waylaid Roger's men following Alan any number of times." Coram took over the cleaning of Lightning while Alanna began to stretch. Her body was stiff from the ordeal, and she had seen Roger enough in the fencing courts to know he would not be easy to beat, even if she were feeling her best. That he was a sorcerer and not a trained knight was balanced by the fact that, for all she knew, he was sticking pins into a new image of her at this very moment. Jonathan looked down at Alanna, who was touching her toes. "But you had suspicions," he pointed out. "Even if they were vague ones, why didn't you talk to me?" "I did say something. At the Black City," she told him frankly. "You said it was nonsense. So I wanted to have real proof before I mentioned it again. And every time I made up my mind to do something about it, I lost interest. I know why now, because he had me in the wraps with you and Miles and the others. But I still feel ashamed that it happened. Don't you?" Before Jonathan could say what he did understand, someone else knocked on Alanna's door. Coram opened it and admitted a heavily cloaked George. Jonathan and Miles were clearly astonished by the tall rogue's presence. "Stefan has messenger birds," Alanna told them. She gave the thief a tiny smile before beginning to stretch again. "I'm glad you came." George reached out to ruffle her hair with a gentle hand. "Do nothing foolish," he warned her. "I think Alan's used up his foolishness for the day," Tom said acidly. Alanna looked up impatient. "The masquerade is over. Miles, all these men know, you should too. I'm a go." "But I do know," Miles said quietly. "Thank you for telling me at last, but I've known for years." Timon rapped on the door and opened it. "I've been sent to bring you to the great throne room," he said unhappily. Sir Alan, is it true about his grace?" Alanna tugged on her boots. Her mouth was suddenly very dry. "Yes, it's true." "Alan and I will be with you in a moment," Jonathan told the others. They took the hint and followed Timon out into the hall, closing the door behind them. Alanna looked at Jonathan and went into his arms, hugging him tightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, fighting back tears. "I know you love him, but I couldn't let it go on. He was killing your mother." Jonathan held her close. "I love you more." His voice was breaking. Don't let him kill you." Alanna shook her head. "I don't plan to. Believe me, I don't." They joined the other men in the hall. No one spoke as they headed for the great throne room. Their only comments were in the tight holds Jonathan and George took on each of her shoulders, and the worried looks Coram, Miles, and Tom wore. Matters now were beyond words. Alanna herself could think only that finally it had come to a head. This weird contest of wills between her and the Duke of Conte. The issue would be decided once and for all. She couldn't be unhappy about that. "It'll be over and settled," she thought as they strode into the great throne room. Roger already stood before the two thrones, naked sword in hand. Alanna hugged each of her friends one last time before stepping up beside Roger, lightning unsheathed and ready for battle. Her heart pounded in her throat as the herald read the challenge. She could barely hear him. Her attention was on the king and queen, on John, standing beside his father now, and on Duke Gareth, standing beside his sister, the queen. She felt a grim kind of triumph, thinking, "Even if he kills me, I've won. I've planted the seed of doubt here. He'll never be trusted again." It was good to know that she had accomplished something, even if Roger killed her. And it was good to know her friends were there, wanting her to win. "Let the combat begin," Rold said quietly. Alanna and Roger brought their swords up instantly. They circled, watching each other carefully. Roger feigned at Alanna several times, never intending to strike, instead trying to draw Alanna into an attack. Alanna smiled slightly. Roger was older than she was and more experienced in ways of the world, but she could outweight him. She was right. Roger attacked in earnest, thinking she was being overconfident. Alanna blocked his swing and dodged to the side, wincing as lightning jarred against her sore hands. She would have to be careful. Her stiffness and the pain in her hands might get her killed if she wasn't. Roger pursued the attack, trying to use up her energy. Alanna tried to dodge more and block less in order to spare herself, but the sorcerer was too quick. Pain wormed its way up her right arm and into her shoulder. The scrapes on her sword hand were bleeding through the bandages, and weariness put her timing off. Suddenly, she blinked. Had Roger switched his sword to his left hand? Or was he carrying two swords? He couldn't possibly have two blades. She shook her head, trying to clear her eyes. Dimly, she could hear Tom yelling, "Foul! He's using an illusion!" But she knew no one would try to stop the fight now, for fear of getting her killed. Only a lucky step saved her life as the Duke lunged at her. Tom was right. The Duke had placed an illusion spell on himself so that Alanna couldn't tell which of his hands gripped the real sword and which held on to the ghost of one. Alanna pulled the ember stone from beneath her shirt with her free hand, thanking the goddess for it. The illusion sword now glowed orange in her eyes. She blocked Roger's real sword and thrust back, corning body to body with the Duke. This was a mistake. The larger, stronger man used his strength to force her slowly to her knees. Alanna gasped and broke, dropping to the floor and rolling away. Roger struck, cutting her shoulder open as Alanna came to her feet. She dodged back, biting her lip angrily. He had changed his sword to his left hand. She thanked the goddess the cut was not bad and gripped the emberstone again. The Duke switched hands several times, but she was able to follow the changing of real and imaginary swords with the help of the stone. They were coming to a time in the battle she was too familiar with. The time when lesser swordsmen began to gasp for air and to make mistakes. The time when she had to reach deep inside herself for strength she rarely needed to draw upon. Forced to admire Roger's technique as she grimly blocked and thrust, lunged and dodged, she couldn't help but think it was too bad such an awful man was such a fine swordsman. Seizing that brief moment when Roger switched swords, Alanna lunged in, slashing the Duke's right arm. Roger yelled in fury as lightning nipped through muscle. Making an impossibly quick recovery, the Duke lunged back and struck. Alanna stumbled, and the tip of Duke Roger's sword sliced down her chest from collarbone to waist. The special corset she often wore in place of bandaging gave way. Its laces cut through. It slid and buckled under her shirt. Edges of lace strings, and, to Alanna's great embarrassment, the curves of her breast showing through. Roger dropped his blade and stood back, his eyes wide with shock. "Halt!" the king roared, coming to his feet. The crowded room was buzzing as he stared at Alanna. "What is going on here?" "You'd better do something about that thing," Tom advised, stepping forward. "I'll explain." All eyes were fixed on the master in silver-edged black as Alanna ducked behind a hanging curtain, suddenly glad her lie was over with. She slid the ruined corset out from under her slashed shirt as Tom said, "You'll have to excuse my sister, Majesties," shaking her head over her brother's nerve. She overlapped the ends of her shirt and tucked them firmly into her breeches. "You see, she wanted to be a knight," Tom was explaining. "I wanted to be a sorcerer. We traded places. I think I may have had the better part of the bargain. I didn't have to lie to people I liked and respect all these years. Here, I brought our birth papers. Her name is Alanna. We're twins." "Who knew of this?" The king's voice was low and dangerous as Alanna stepped out from behind the curtain. "Who knew?" "I knew." Jonathan's voice was strong and clear. "I've known since the Black City." "I knew," Coram admitted in a shamefaced rumble. Gary stepped forward. "I knew." "And I knew," Miles added. I guessed when Alanna, cured Jonathan of the sweating sickness, Majesty. The king looked at Alanna. What have you to say for yourself? Alanna met his eyes squarely. I hated lying to you, she admitted. I wanted to tell, but I couldn't. Would you have let me win my shield if I had told the truth? The king's silence was answer enough. I've tried to be honest about everything else, and I can't regret what I did. Roger's snarl of fury surprised them all. You demon! He screamed. You lying, cheating! Without warning, he lunged at her, his sword raised. Alanna blocked him and fought for her life. Roger attacked like a whirlwind, not giving her a chance to catch her breath. Suddenly, Alanna's long-hidden anger towards Roger flared into life. He was her enemy. He had tried to kill the people she loved, and he was acting like the wronged one. She set her jaw grimly. She had come here to bring Duke Roger of Conte to justice. And by the mother, that's what she was going to do. She brought lightning up and around in a wide butterfly sweep that slicked off a lock of Roger's hair. Switching her sword to her left hand, she attacked in earnest at last, bringing her blade down and around in a mirror image of the first butterfly sweep, slicing Roger's belt. She came around with a backhanded slash that ripped open the Duke's tunic. Desperate, Roger blocked and fell back as she came on, a grim vision of death. Suddenly, a large orange cloud formed around the Duke. The watching nobles gasped and moved away as the cloud expanded, reaching for Alanna and for Jonathan and for King Rold beside Jonathan. Alanna saw the danger to the two men and forgot her own. The goddess! She yelled, leaping forward. Lightning struck the cloud, slicing it open to find Roger at its heart. The orange mass flared, blinding everyone watching. Alanna felt lightning quiver. Roger screamed, and she struck again harder. The sword cut even deeper this time as Alanna opened her eyes, blinking to clear her vision. Roger stood, trying to pull her sword out of his body. A deep cut in his shoulder was bleeding fiercely. The Duke stared wonderingly at Alanna as he slowly fell to the floor. Alanna jerked lightning free of him, swaying over Roger's body, shaking with rage, fear, and exhaustion. She looked up. Everyone in the chamber, even Jonathan, even Tom, stared at her with some kind of horror. For a moment, she was afraid of herself. She had killed the king's nephew. She had killed her greatest enemy, the most powerful sorcerer in the Eastern lands. Epilogue. Are you sure you won't change your mind? Jonathan asked, taking her hand. The winter breeze whipped color into his cheeks, making his eyes seem bluer than ever. I really feel I don't know Sir Alanna at all. Alanna smiled and shook her head. I need to be alone. Well, not exactly alone, she admitted, grinning at the bundled-up quorum. I need to get away from court for a while and just think. If you're still feeling bad about Roger, you shouldn't, Gary said tartly. You did what had to be done. I know, but I've been planning this journey for a long time, and now I have more reason than ever to take it. I'll sort out Roger and being a lady knight and what I want to do with my life, and then I'll come back. She looked around, making sure that her saddlebags, as well as those on the pack mule, were secure. She glanced up at her worried escort. Jonathan, Gary, Rawl, and George all and smiled at them. Truly I will. I couldn't stay away long. Gary tapped the miserable-looking Rawl on the shoulder. Say goodbye, Rawl, he said, glancing meaningfully at John. Rawl took one of Alanna's hands in a grip that hurt. I'm like Jonathan. I just don't feel I know Sir Alanna, he complained. Look out for her, Coram. I will that, the burly manservant nodded. Alanna leaned over and kissed Rawl on the cheek. This Alanna, you keep talking about is just Alan with the truth being told, she told him. I haven't changed. Stay out of trouble, Rawl. Gary was next, giving her a brief but strong hug. If you stay away too long, we'll come looking for you, he threatened. Safe journey, Alanna. He drew Rawl off a little way, leaving Alanna to talk with Jonathan and George in peace. Remember the thieves' sign I taught you? George warned, and if trouble threatens, use it. Alanna hugged him, blinking back stinging tears. I'm going to miss you, old friend, she whispered. George's eyes were overbright as he smiled at her. So much more reason for you to return to me, after you've thought through all that needs thinking. Go with my love, Alanna. Clucking to his mare, he caught up with Gary and Rawl. Jonathan tried to smile in his turn. And so it's just you and me again, Lady Knight? Well, you mean Faithful. He acknowledged the cat, who sat blinking in his cup on Moonlight's saddle. Suddenly, he reached over and hugged her tightly. Holding her for long moments, he kissed her fiercely before letting her go. You're riding south? Alanna nodded. I want to spend the rest of this winter being warm, she told him. All right. You know I will. He lifted her face, looking into her violet eyes. When you come home, all this will have blown over, he said, and no one will be happier to see you than I. He looked over at Coram, who was waiting by the city gates. Take care of her, Coram Smithison. Alanna's old friend looked surprised. And here I thought the best part of riding with a knight was that she would be looking after me. Alanna exchanged one last look at her prince before riding out of the gate. Before her stretched the great road south, its broad expanse clear of snow and ice. It was almost warm for the first day of the new year. She was dressed comfortably. She had a good horse, and Faithful with her, and Coram at her side. Roger's death was bad, she thought, but life could be much, much worse. Perhaps I'll live and be happy after all. She let out a whoop of sheer exuberance and kicked Moonlight into a gallop. Come on, Coram, she cried, galloping past him. Let's go find an adventure! So that's the end of our book, guys. It took so long to get here, but we're finally here. Alrighty, so thoughts. For one thing, her friends are like a box of puppies, I swear. They're all noses and tails. They have no idea what they're doing. And poor Rawl, he was like, I didn't get to know you. And she's like, oh, I'm still me, just, with a longer name. And he's like, yeah, whatever. I love Gary. I love how when Tom was explaining everything, he was like, yeah, so she's actually my sister. I know, strange, right? Here's our birth certificates. Those you can keep. I made copies. It's cool. So I wanted to be a sorcerer. The whole knighthood thing, not for me. She wanted to be a knight, because the whole lady thing, also not for her. So we switched places. And I think we're all caught up. I think we can deduce what happened from there. What else? Oh, yeah. She has been lying to you for, a long time, but, a lot of us knew. And, the kid's freaking out. And everybody else is like, yeah, I knew. Me over here, your son, totally knew. Your nephew, also knew. Your greatest advisor, yeah, I've known for, literal years, longer than, Jonathan has known, I'd like to point out. I love that. If I could write the Cliff's Notes for this book, I totally would, and it would all be, millennial Gen Z speak, I swear, which is cringeworthy on its own, given my age. I'm 33, by the way. So, yeah, that was, Such a good book. I'm so excited to start the new one. Also, we have 2 more books in this series. Once this series is done, I think I'm going to give Tamora Pierce a little bit of a break and pick another book to read. I already have one suggestion of, what was it? Shit. Right. Oh, it was Ella Enchanted, one of my favorite books, truly, from when I was a kid. It was one that my mom read to us. I was also thinking about The Secret Garden, also a favorite of mine. And then, I don't know, I want you guys' suggestions, because I love all different genres of books. I do want to keep it in the fiction side and not the nonfiction. Just because nonfiction for me is a little boring. Like, watch a documentary. It's cool. So yeah, I would love to hear what you guys suggest in those comments down below. Guys, this has been an epic adventure. She has gone from becoming the Princess Squire to helping to take care of her father's estates after he passed away. I know, no big loss there. He was kind of a jerk. To finding out that her brother is interesting, falling in love, being fallen in love with, in terms of Jonathan and George. She has gotten her shield, revealed a heavy secret, one that threatened to kill our dear sweet Queen Leanne. Rude. So, I mean, she went through a lot of things in this book. A whole lot. So the next book is also very good. I'm probably going to do that one probably next weekend is when I'll start it. If I have time during the week, I may start it. I may also start doing 2 chapters at a time. Don't hold me to that, because we all know I'm a whole mess of a human. But yeah, so guys, we're done with this one. But I'm excited for the next. So leave your comments down below. Let me know your thoughts, what you're thinking. Let me know what you thought of the book itself, of book suggestions for the future. I don't have a whole lot of books anymore. A lot of mine were destroyed when our basement flooded a couple years ago. So I had to throw a bunch of books out. But any books that you guys suggest, I will add to a list, and I will get them as I can afford to. Because, life's a little hard, right? Life's hard right now. I get it. So yeah. This has been super fun. And I love you guys. I'll see you on the next one, okay? Okay, I love you. Bye.